Well, thank you very much, Nick, and thanks to all of you for the very generous invitation to be here. There's definitely the most banners that I've ever given a talk in front of. It's fantastic to be here. I'm always astonished that anyone manages to be inside on days like this. I realize that they're all like this, but coming from the Northeast, it's hard to keep in mind. So my talk is mostly focused on the ways in which US legal arrangements have encouraged a particular kind of philanthropy. And what I'm going to try to do is try to understand whether there's a coherent policy reason for that approach to philanthropy, or whether maybe alternative approaches would have, or might in the future make more sense. And if so, to try to think some more about what changes to law and governance we might want to think about if we think that our current policy choices might be mistaken. And one frame to think about those issues would be an inequality frame. Right? This is a slide such as you've probably seen a lot recently. This one happens to come from Sayers and Zuckman. Gabriel has a new book out, which is really good, which you should read. And the point, of course, is that the wealth held by the top 10th of 1% is about the same as the wealth held in the United States by the bottom 90% of the population. And what's striking about that to me is if one of the reasons that this raises concerns, if it does for you, is because of the extent to which there is influence or power or control by one group over society, it might not make sense that we leave out of this determination of wealth an additional pool of wealth that might be held by organizations that are controlled by the individuals who are in the top 10th of 1%, right? That is, the previous slide doesn't include the now, by most estimates, about $1 billion that are held by organizations that we might call private foundations. That's a technical tax term, but mostly the organizations that you think of as foundations, by and large, are also the things that the tax code calls private foundations. There are a couple of other kinds of organizations that the tax code describes that look kind of like foundations from the outside but are a little bit different, such as supporting organizations. And if you threw them in there, you'd get another about $300 billion. And so there's a reasonable amount of money, and the amount of money held by these organizations has grown considerably over time. And over that period, the amount of money that they spend annually has also increased, as you might expect. If I put these two curves on top of one another, you would see that spending has not grown quite as much as assets have, but it's fairly close. Still, if you look at the label here to the left, you see these numbers are much smaller. They're something like 6 or 7% of the numbers on the previous slide. That is, these are organizations that control an enormous amount of wealth and are spending only a relatively small fraction of it each year. And my argument is that is largely due to US legal arrangements. Before I talk about those, I want to say I'm going to focus on these particular kinds of organizations, philanthropic organizations, which we often call foundations, but I don't want to suggest that they're the only kind of nonprofit organization that has an enormous pool of wealth that they're not spending. We're sitting in a building that's owned by one of those, right? And higher ed institutions also hold about $500 billion in assets currently, and they also have spending patterns that are similar to the spending patterns of private foundations for similar legal reasons, by and large. I'm not going to talk about universities in my time, but if you want to talk about them, I'm happy to talk about them. I was talking to Congress about them recently. They raise similar policy issues. Okay. So this slide's a little small, sorry, but let me just define what I mean by restricted spending philanthropy. I called that a problem on the first slide, right? I suggested that the fact that these organizations are spending only a small fraction of their assets might be a problem. Why are they spending only a small fraction of their assets? By and large, it's because there are legal rules that govern the organization that prevent the money from being spent faster. And usually many of you in this room, I'm sure, know this. Those legal rules are contract-like. They derive from the terms of gifts that were given to the institution under some condition. And if the donor does not specify, state law usually presumes that the gift, if it's intended for any particular purpose, is also intended to last in perpetuity. And what that means is that the managers of the organization have to manage the money and spend it out in such a way to try to ensure that the money will last forever. Some other gifts will be more explicit about how rapidly they can be paid out. Some institutions will interpret that term, perpetuity, in a way that has some mathematical translation. A lot of universities, for instance, will say if we have a perpetual gift, that means we can't spend more than 5% of the assets in a given year. A lot of foundations have a similar rule of thumb where if they have a perpetual gift, they're not spending more than 5 to 6% of the net assets in a particular year. And so the question I want to raise is, I'm going to argue that there are legal rules that encourage this set of behaviors, the giving of gifts subject to restrictions and the maintaining them in perpetuity. And the question is why? So the government, in essence, is pushing organizations towards a particular way of managing their money, managing it in perpetuity and parceling it out in small pieces. And usually we think, your undergraduate public finance class, we're not going to have government regulation unless we think the market, private actors are doing something wrong. So are there reasons to think that the managers of these organizations would be spending money too fast, if not for these rules that are encouraging them to spend it slower? I think, if anything, we would expect the opposite. And so let me first convince you that, in fact, law is encouraging this set of behaviors. I think it does it in several different ways. One is simply the fact that when you give money subject to a restriction so that the money isn't going to be paid until later, what happens is that you get a deduction immediately as soon as the assets are transferred to the title to the assets is transferred to the foundation. But that money can be spent whenever. In fact, if it's a perpetual gift, by definition, the principal amount of the gift will never be spent. So you get a tax deduction for donating the money, even while the money is not actually being spent. And of course, this is particularly attractive if, even though the title to the money is passed out of your hands, control hasn't. That is, the money is still working for you even though you've gotten a donation for giving it away. For example, you could build a really big building and put your name on the side of it. And you may have heard that name recognition is valuable for some people. The other big tax incentive that's at work here is the fact that once the assets are inside the private foundation, investment returns are no longer subject to taxation. And for those of you who are really into taxes, there's sort of an asterisk there about why this is an advantage, and we can talk about that. There are ways that donors can approximate that advantage without moving the money to the foundation, but it's hard. Okay. So if you just do the numbers on the back of the envelope, this tax subsidy amounts to something like $20 billion per year. The reason that it encourages restricted spending is essentially what it means is the longer the money sits in the organization's hands, the bigger the government subsidy is. Also, I won't get into this too much unless we have time and you're interested. In addition to these federal tax rules, there are also parallel state tax rules, generally the same in 36 states. And also there are state organizational laws, particular laws that govern how foundations can be run and that govern the treatment of restricted gifts. And not only do they require state attorneys general to enforce these provisions, although it's sort of spotty, which states actually do. California is one of them that takes it seriously. There are also 13 states that since 2006 have had a rule that says that if the organization spends more than 7% of its net assets in a year, there's a presumption the managers are doing their job wrong, and the Attorney General is obliged to step in and make them do something different. They can rebut that presumption. I'll show you at the end, not really surprisingly, those laws have actually mattered. Okay? I mentioned that there are a few different, for tax purposes, flavors of foundation subject to different rules. If you're interested, I'll come back to this slide. I'm not going to belabor it. The only point I want to make is there's another kind of organization you might not have heard that much about called the Donor Advised Fund. And I'll show you towards the end that they're increasingly important. And they're essentially exempt from most of the restrictions that apply to private foundations. And it's worth thinking about whether that makes sense. Okay. So my main message is that these organizations are super important to society. They do all kinds of fantastic things. I just wish they would do more of it. I wish they would do it better. That is to say that I think that the optimal level of spending is higher than the level that the government is currently encouraging. And the reason for that is I think that there are some costs to waiting. There are a few that are pretty well recognized in the literature and that I won't belabor. People have been saying this for 100 years, essentially, that when you make a gift and have it spent 100 years later, you have a big agency problem. Once you're dead, it's hard to make sure the managers are doing what you want with their money. This is the story of the Ford Foundation. And there's also the so-called dead hand problem, right? When the idea you had 100 years ago for what makes society good is probably not necessarily so accurate 100 years later. The literally textbook example I teach all the time is there's lots of gifts to universities for the education of promising young white boys, which we don't think of as a particularly good use, or at least a restriction that we want to respect in the moment. Okay, everyone knows that. My story is to add a few nuances to that story. There's an additional aspect to the information story that we can talk about. I won't get into it in depth. The ones I want to focus on are these opportunity costs and diminishing marginal returns. So the opportunity costs, right, when you don't spend money now, that means that there are projects that you could have invested in that would have had returns. Now, for sure, when you're investing the money, that means that over time you'll have more money to spend. But that's only a good investment if you didn't have the opportunity to make a better one somewhere else. And so my argument is there are lots of social returns available from spending that exceed the usual investment returns on holding the assets. They're not that hard to find. For example, early childhood education for disadvantaged households. Most of the data tell us the returns on those are really good. Better than 10%, probably better than you could get from a hedge fund. That's not even counting what I call the indirect costs. These are the lost opportunities to learn and experiment. Right? Lots of people write about the foundation sector. Joel Fleischman at Duke is one of them who has a book about this. I talk about what a fantastic and essentially unreplicated. Right? There's no other place in our society where we get the kinds of opportunities to do policy experiments on a large scale as we have with the projects that foundations are running. Right? We're doing that experiment right now in real time with secondary education funded by foundations by and large. Right? So if you're not funding projects, you don't have an opportunity to learn how to do the next project better. Okay. The diminishing marginal returns point, this idea is pretty familiar probably to the economists among you. One of them is just that by moving money to the future, we're probably moving it from a time when it's more useful to a time when it's less useful. That's because on average, we think people in the future are going to be richer and need the money less. But also, if you just focus within the private foundation sector, right, you would think if private foundation managers are kind of rational, they're going to pick their best project and fund that one first, and then go down the list. So the more money you have, the farther down the list you get. You get to a project that isn't as good as the first choice. So as the foundation grows, the projects it's funding are getting less and less payoff at the margin. And the thing is, the foundation sector keeps getting bigger and bigger. This is a chart. The red line is just expenditures from a sample of large sample of private foundations, about 10, 12,000 a year. And the dotted line is inflows. So even in the biggest recession in 100 years, in 80 years, right, the private foundation sector still did not get smaller. There's never been a year in which the private foundation sector shrank. So this means that by saving, the sector is transferring money from a time when the marginal returns are higher to a time when they're lower. That is when the sector is bigger. Okay, we can talk about them. The methods here, they're not super interesting. It's just descriptive data. Okay. Now look, there are also, I think, compelling and important reasons to have a pool of money available in private foundations. It just happens to be the case that I think many of those compelling reasons are, by and large, reasons that the organization should have to go out and do fundraising. Or to put it another way, if you're going to argue we need foundations to have money available, there are two ways to get that pool of money. Right? One is to parcel it out a little bit over time, and the other is to spend it quickly and then go out and raise new money to keep doing what you're doing. And the arguments that we've heard for private foundations, by and large, don't distinguish between those two sources of money. So unless you tell me a story about why private foundations shouldn't have to or can't go out and raise new money, I think these arguments aren't persuasive. So some of the arguments are things like firm-specific expertise. Right? You have a bunch of program officers who've spent 10 years developing relationships with operating charities on the ground. They know how to do it and who to go to for a new project. Right? What a waste it would be to break up that team. So you don't want the organization to close necessarily, but that's not to say that it can't go out and get new money. The Gates Foundation has a promise of another, I think it's $10-odd billion from Warren Buffett once the Gates money essentially runs out. I think that's more or less the structure as I understand it. Buffett says they have to spend the Gates money first before they can spend his money. So it's not impossible. And maybe it's the case that people prefer to give money to an organization that has their name on the side of the building. But then the question becomes, how do you persuade people who would prefer not to fundraise to fundraise? One way would be to allow perpetuities. Another might be to give them a different set of tax incentives. And there would be a question about which is more socially costly. Okay. Some other arguments for having private foundations. Again, I think in some cases, private foundations spend their money slowly over time, restricted spending. I think in many cases, it's not that these are incoherent arguments. It's that they are incoherent arguments for having a tax subsidy that grows the slower the organization spends its money. So here's what I mean by that. There's a real option story. If you're Gates, do you want to fund the first vaccine that comes along, or do you want to have a choice between 3 or 4 vaccines and then get behind the one that is the most effective? Necessarily, that means you're going to want to wait a while, but at some point you're going to have to get behind the winner and spend. So I don't think that real option theory is kind of a justification for perpetual restricted spending. Counter-cyclical spending, I again think this is a great story. Right? Governments have trouble saving for recessions. We know that they ought to be spending more during recessions, by and large. Well, what if private foundations, by saving, could serve as a supplemental source of stimulus during recessions? Essentially, they're private contractors for the government in doing counter-cyclical spending. That would make sense, except it's not descriptively true. Right? This graph is, again, just that graph of spending by private foundations since 2001. And if you look for the recessions, you don't really see any evidence that private foundation spending was up during those times, if anything, down a little bit here in 2008 and 2009. And that's perfectly understandable once you understand the legal environment that they're operating in, an environment that requires them to spend at least 5% of their assets each year. And when their assets are dipping, that floor is dropping also. So what I would say about this counter-cyclical spending argument is if we're serious about it as a policy goal, we ought to have legal rules that actually encourage or ensure counter-cyclical spending from private foundations if that's going to be a justification for restricting their spending. No one has clarifying questions? I feel like I'm talking New Yorker fast, but that's okay with you guys? New Yorker fast is also LA?
Yes,
okay. Fast? All right. I'm a lawyer, and so I had an oral argument in Arkansas once, and the first 10 minutes of my argument, the only thing the judge said, and he said it 3 times, was, "Counsel, you must speak slower." He said it 3 times, and I still couldn't do it. All right. So I think at a minimum, there aren't good reasons to think that foundation managers are spending let me get the direction right, they're spending too fast. Right? There aren't good reasons to think that the government's policy should be to encourage slower spending. Well, if you're convinced about that, what should we do about it? And so I do think that a full repeal of the existing tax preferences is tricky and probably not good policy. So for example, there's a bill recently introduced by a congressman whose district strangely includes Cornell University, and his proposal is to tax endowment returns. And I just think this is a lousy idea for lots of reasons, among others because it does weird things to the incentives of managers. And also, when you tax capital, you produce distortions. And one of the reasons that nonprofits get good returns is because they don't have to worry about the taxation of their investment. So I just don't think that that's necessarily a good approach. An alternative which doesn't accomplish everything that you might want it to accomplish is you might reduce the value of the donation that someone makes if it's subject to a restricted gift. For example, you could back out the present value of the tax subsidy that the government is going to give in the future to that gift. In other words, if the present value of exempting that stream of income from taxation is $10 million, you reduce this year's $20 million deduction by $10 million to $10 million. That doesn't do anything about the $1 trillion that's already under management and being spent slowly. For that reason, I tend to favor a couple of these other ideas, in particular the payout rule. So I alluded to already, the tax code says that if you're this organization that it calls a private foundation, that you have to spend at least 5% of your net investment assets. Each year is an oversimplification, but it's essentially within a year, each time you earn assets by the end of that tax year, you have to spend 5% of it by the end of the next tax year. Okay. So I just think that that rate could be higher. And typically what one hears from folks in the foundation sector is that that 5% number is about the biggest number that they could spend out and maintain the current size of the foundation sector in perpetuity. That is, any faster rate would threaten the perpetual existence of the nonprofit sector, and I just don't think that's true. So let me show you why I'm skeptical about it. Right, so typically the evidence that they point to is a series of studies paid for by essentially an advocacy group that works on behalf of the foundation sector. And it's a non-random sample of about 40 foundations from Michigan. And they report real returns in those 40 foundations of about 5%. That is after inflation. So there are a couple other sources that have much higher rates, but those other sources have problems. They only were a couple of years, or there's just a cross-section. So what I did is I went to the IRS data over about 27 years, again with that about 10,000 firms per year. It's a random sample, but it's not entirely random because firms above a certain size are all in. Those caveats aside, it's at least more random than the sample that the foundation sector gives us. The real returns I find are about 10%. That's just returns on investment assets. If you think that organizations could also be spending out of future assets, as I suggested, right, if you think that the marginal returns in the future are going to be low, one thing you might do is essentially borrow against them to spend now when the returns are higher. So if we include the growth rate both through investment returns and also new donations, I find an average growth rate, real growth rate of about 18%. So that's to say, I think that you could set a payout rate that is much higher than 5% and not worry about the foundation sector getting any smaller than its current real size. Now, it is true that at a higher payout rate, there would be a greater risk that an individual foundation might have its assets become very low. My argument is that what we should be concerned about from a governance perspective, from a policy perspective, is the sector as a whole and not any one foundation by and large. And by the way, what you think is important is the rate of growth in this sector relative to the size of the economy, it's growing a lot faster than the economy over this period, again, 85 to 2012, and a couple of big complete economic cycles in this period, as you know. Okay. So the other issue that I mentioned, and I won't labor this too much, because again, I don't think it's super interesting, but is that there's parallel state law here as well. In 2006, starting in 2006, it wasn't all in 2006, states began adopting a model act, the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional, I always blank on what the F is. It's a rule that governs finance? Institutional Funds Act, yes, thank you very much. Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act. It makes several changes to the rules for how managers can invest and spend their money. And it deals only with organizations that are organized as corporations. There are other charities, about a third of them, that are organized just a slightly different organizational form as trusts. So no change in law for trusts. And one of the optional provisions that states could adopt in this Uniform Act was a rule that, as I said before, if you spend more than 7% of your net assets, you're presumed to be imprudent. And what I find is, not super surprisingly, that this law didn't affect trusts, and so in the year that a state adopts this act, whether you're a state with the cap or the state without, there's no effect on trusts. But there is an effect, so this is sort of a triple difference story. There is an effect on corporations. The act appears to have modestly increased spending among all the organizations, but in the states that didn't have a cap, spending went up a lot more than in states that did have a cap. One way of describing this result is that the cap reduced the probability that a firm would spend more than the absolute federal floor of 5% by about 7%. So long story short, the cap matters, or it appears to matter. There are some econometric problems with the triple difference story, mostly in the parallel trends part of it, of course. The usefulness of being able to do the triple difference design is I have two different kinds of controls. But I have, in a given year, I can compare firms in states that enact this statute with the cap against firms in states that enact the statute without the cap, and I can compare those firms against firms in states that don't enact the statute. So in theory, I should be able to control non-parametrically for whatever is happening in the stock market. But for sure, this is a noisy period, and it could be that we might think that the financial crisis would affect one type of organization differently than others. Yeah, okay, I agree. I don't want to make too much of these results. All I want to say is there's not, even in the people who wrote this act, there's an official explanation from the NCUSL, which is the organization that promulgates these uniform acts. And they explain why all the provisions are in there. And the explanation for why this cap is in there is some industry advocates told us they wanted this. So there's not a good, they don't really even try to come up with a great policy for why it's in there. So the only thing I want to say about this is it's not clear to me what good these caps are doing currently. Okay. So I think I want to stop there. Let me just say one last thing about donor-advised funds. The tax code, as I said, imposes this 5% payout requirement on organizations that it calls private foundations. That's to be distinguished from another category in the tax code called public charities. What's the difference? Basically, it's where you get your money from. If you get your money from lots of people, you're a public charity. There are also some organizations that are automatically public charities, like schools and hospitals. If you're a public charity, you're not subject to the 5% payout requirement. So a donor-advised fund, technically a donor-advised fund is just an account that is held on behalf of some donor. For example, Fidelity, I don't know how many people have a donor-advised fund in the room. At Fidelity, you can take your mutual fund money and slide it over to the donor-advised fund. You take a charitable contribution deduction when you do that. And Fidelity says, henceforth, right, you give us advice about where to allocate that money. That is, you tell us where to donate that money. And because people wouldn't give them any more money if they didn't follow the advice for all practical purposes is binding. So to the donor, it still looks like their money to donate, but they get a deduction at the time they move it over to the donor advised fund, and it can't come back. That is one thing for sure it does. It locks the money into an account that can only be spent for charitable purposes. But because the donor advised fund sponsor is holding lots of these accounts, in the case of Fidelity, millions of them, it's not a private foundation. So donor advised fund donors are not subject to the 5% payout rule. And they also escape some other unwanted administrative burdens that come with private foundations. There's a lot of things that donor advised funds do that are fantastic. And because of that, they've grown very rapidly. This is a graph of contributions to donor advised funds. Recently, you see just between 2011 and 2012, assets controlled by donor advised fund sponsors went up by $7 billion. and new contributions went from 10 to about $14 billion. So it's a field that's growing very rapidly, and they're now big enough to be worth thinking about a little bit. And again, they're not subject to any payout rule. Recent data from the IRS reports that about 1/4 of donor-advised fund sponsors average a payout rate of 0. But as a whole, donor-advised funds average a payout rate of 16%. Right, so a lot of dispersion in their payout rate. So all I want to say about this is if you're a little convinced at least that payout rates are potentially appropriate, the fact that donor-advised funds aren't subject to any payout requirement at all is something that I think is worth thinking about.